Well, another very warm welcome back, all my vintage dirt bike loving YouTube browsers and subscribers, and thanks to you all once again for tuning in to my classic dirt bike TV channel. Now, coming up in this next video posting, we're going to take a walk through the racing paddocks once again of the last few years, and I've picked out another selection of old vintage iron that I think you may enjoy taking a look at. And this, of course, will be the latest in this volume 6 edition of the series. So I do hope you enjoy what we've put together here. So enough crack from me just now. Let's just jump straight into our first machine. Yes, thanks once again for tuning in, and we're going to start with a very brief look at Barry Smith's quite nice Yamaha YZ 250M Evolution bike. Now, with regards the actual year of Barry's machine, I'm not entirely sure, although it does look very much like a 1991 bike or thereabouts, but please, of course, feel free to correct me on that point if I'm wrong. And I'm sure you don't need me to tell you about just how awesome these YZ250 Yamahas are, because there's been many variations of YZs built throughout the years, and each and every one of them were pretty good all-round racers, and this particular example of Barry Smith's is another little cracker. Now, of course, the heart of these YZ250s were always their fantastic reed valve two-stroke motors, and it always amazed me how much of a punch these little 250 power plants could produce. But these Evolution bikes, of course, had the new upside-down front forks, and because it was an Evolution bike, the single rear shock and linkage was fitted onto that heavy-duty alloy box section swing arm. And as I remember, these Evolution 250s had a 5-speed gearbox, and the fuel was fed into the motor through that reed valve induction block. And once again, modern style disc brakes on the front and rear of Barry's machine. It's also been fitted with a very nice FMF alloy tailpipe at the rear. Now, the rear shock is a very good quality white power unit, but this 250 two-stroke motor is a very strong little engine, and even more modern YZs are still using variations on these older motors to this very day. And it's a well-known fact that many riders who start their racing careers on these YZs tend to stick with the mark throughout their racing careers, such as the popularity and the appeal of these Yamaha YZ motocrossers. And certain riders will not even contemplate changing to either Honda or any other make of bike, as most of the time these YZ250s do absolutely everything they're needed to do in terms of racing performance on the racetrack. But you have to admit that this particular example here of Barry's is a very nice looking machine, and these few video clips were actually taken just before Barry was getting ready to race it at a Scottish Twin Shock and Evolution race event at Pow Mill just a few years back. Okay, our next featured bike is a big 500 4-stroke machine again, and this big KTM is Kevin McGuire's race machine. Now, once again, the actual year of Kevin's bike is a bit of a mystery to me, although I'm going to stick my neck out here once again on the chopping block and say that I think it's a 1985 model, but as usual, I'm standing by to be corrected immediately. But I suspect that this big 4-banger is quite a beastie to ride, and I can see that it's also fitted here with one of those American-made Super Trap spark arrestor tailpipes. Now, once again, these KTM 4-strokers were of course powered by the Austrian-made Rotax 500 4-stroke power plants, which again were simply just bulletproof engines, and although they were slightly on the heavy side, they did have a good reputation for reliability and good power output. Now Kevin's bike looks again like it's fitted with a pair of what looks like white power front forks, which makes the bike look very tall at the front end. So if you were a rider who was a bit short in the leg department, then you might need to stand on a box to sling your leg over this old girl. Now, as I remember, the rear brake backplate was also made of magnesium, probably to keep the overall weight of the bike down to a reasonable level. And once again, the single shock rear suspension was a white power unit with remote reservoir that could be adjusted from the right hand side of the bike. Now, all the moving parts on this engine were kept in sync by this rubber tooth belt hidden behind this cover, and one of the plus points of this cam belt driven system is that if a belt were to break when the motor was running, there was absolutely no collision of valves and piston, and the motor just simply stopped. And it's usually just a case of retiming everything again, fitting a new belt, and you're good to go. Although, mind you, if you're an old four-stroke motocross bike fan, then I can imagine that this old KTM will probably appeal to you, but they're of course not everybody's idea of an ideal off-road racer, mainly because these were certainly a big heavy lump of a bike to chuck around a racetrack. Although the plus side of course was that those four-stroke Rotax motors could certainly cope easily with any abuse that was dished out by its rider. Okay, next up we're going to take a very quick look around Greg Speed's 1967 500 Cheney BSA bike. Now another one of those very nice machines built by Eric Cheney, the master frame builder, who was also quite a successful racer in his day before he became a motocross chassis designer and builder. But Eric Cheney was another of the top British off-road bike builders of the 1960s and 70s, and he was also known for chalking his frame designs on the wall of his workshop and then scrubbing them out and starting all over again. And he was actually quoted one day as saying, "I know when a design is absolutely right, and it just screams at me when it's wrong." And that was a philosophy that Eric lived by for many years. And the funny thing about that was that it worked. And just before anybody makes a comment, the answer is no. This is not a diesel-powered 500 Cheney BSA, but you can see that some of the casing material here has been cut away, probably to shave off precious grams of weight from this 500 BSA motor. But again, another nice looking classic, that's for sure, and with the added prestige of it being an Eric Cheney framed BSA, a quite rare piece of vintage iron indeed. Now, on the subject of vintage iron, here's another nice old timer, and this is Mike Walker's classic Matchless Racer. Well, the engine's certainly from a Matchless, but Mike tells me that the rest of the bike is another one of these Frankenstein machines that's been made up using parts of other types of motorcycles, so don't be looking for originality on this old girl. Now, Mike also told me that this bike used to be raced by his dad many years ago, but he's not now able to compete on the bike, so Mike gives it a run out at various classic events from time to time, like this one here at Penrith in 2019. Now, I'm certainly no expert on these older bikes, although I do think this is a 500 G80 motor from around 1957 or 1958 or thereabouts, and these were quite good long stroking torquey motors that had quite low compression and were relatively easy enough to kickstart. And when you look around Mike's machine, you can see the many different parts that go into making this a cheap and cheerful pre-65 Scrambles bike, and It just goes to show that you don't need to spend thousands of pounds building a thoroughbred vintage racer when you can just use whatever's lying around in your workshop to build a decent usable racer that you can have a bit of fun on. Now, of course, as you know, the Matchless company were among one of the oldest British motorcycle manufacturers, and their origins date way back to the early 1900s, so they certainly have some history. The front forks on Mike's machine look distinctly like they could be from a BSA or similar bike, although this quite large diameter drum brake certainly looks like it's also a BSA part. Now, these Matchless motors were a 2-valve 4-stroke pushrod engine that I think had a 4-speed gearbox and a dry sump, which had the motor's engine oil housed in this separate storage tank here just behind the motor. Now, as far as I know, the clutch was also a dry clutch and not housed in a bath of oil as many conventional bikes now use, but it's certainly a treat to see these older bikes still being put to good use and not just rusting away under a cover in somebody's old shed somewhere. And okay, this isn't an original Matchless bike from back in the day, but I'll bet you one thing, that Mike will have just as much fun riding this bike as someone who has spent several £1,000s on a top Rickman or Matisse Scrambler. Now, it's not an original bike by any means, but nevertheless it's still a nice old bike to have a bit of fun on. Okay, just to finish off this volume 6 of our bikes from the Paddock series, we're going to check out Dougie Harrow's 500 Curtis Honda. Now, once again, Curtis Bikes is another of the British manufacturers who have been building these very high quality Curtis chassis since 1972, when the company was originally formed by Brian Curtis. Now, Brian Curtis again was also a famous rider back in the 1960s, and he went on to initially build frames for the Rickman brothers before going on his own with these Curtis bikes. Now, as you know, many of these Curtis machines, and specifically these Hondas, were based around this XR500 Honda 4-stroke motor, which were mainly chosen because of their power output and reputation for being very reliable and rugged. Now, these motors were a 4-stroke 4-valve engine with a twin-port cylinder head that used the 2 header pipes that went into a single-bore tailpipe at the rear. Now, in their standard form, these were not the most powerful power plants for a racing bike, but with a few mods and some tuning, these old XR engines could be turned into a very competitive package, and specialist tuners like HPF, the horsepower factory, specialise in getting the most from these XR motors. Now, on the rear of Dougie's Curtis Honda is a good quality pair of Works Performance twin shocks, which, as you can see, give a very generous amount of travel at the bike's rear end, and you can just imagine the sound that comes out of that big megaphone tailpipe when that 500 Honda motor barks into life. Now, once again, a magnesium rear brake backplate that's bolted onto this Honda rear hub, and also the bike's steel swing arm is yet another one of the very high quality parts that are manufactured in-house by the Curtis chassis building company. Now, one or two of the other parts on this Honda machine, like this alloy fuel tank, are more than likely sourced from other Honda models like the CR range, but Dougie did tell me that this particular bike was authenticated by the Curtis company, and that it was indeed certainly one of the machines put together by them a few years ago. But once again, if you're a fan of these kind of 4-stroke dirt bikes, then this Curtis Honda will certainly appeal to your particular taste, because it does have a top of the range frame built by one of Britain's top chassis builders, and of course is also powered by one of Honda's most successful engines. So there's not much to dislike here in Dougie Harrow's lovely Curtis Honda. Well, I hope you enjoyed that latest collection of classic racers from the Paddocks of the last few years in that Volume 6 edition of the series. And don't forget, we will continue this series of Paddock videos in future postings here on my channel. Okay, coming up in my next video, we're going to take a look at a picture slideshow of Raymond Thompson's quite comprehensive vintage dirt bike collection. As you can see, Raymond has one or two quite nice machines in his assortment of old classic dirt bikes. So we will take a look at Raymond's bikes in my next video posting. But until then, of course, everybody continue to stay safe and well, and remember to go for those vaccines when you're offered, because that may be the very best way that we can all get back to some kind of normality when we go to look at these vintage bikes in the natural environment. So until then, everybody stay safe and well until we all return once again to speak about old vintage iron right here on Classic Dirt Bike TV.